Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Tuesday, June 18th, and the Yankees are back on track. We've had 3 terrific starts in a row now from the combination of Chad Green and Nestor Cortez Jr. on Saturday. Paxton was excellent on Sunday, and best of all was just an absolute masterpiece, a work of art from Tanaka last night, who's been our best pitcher overall. Complete game shutout. Those are 3 words you do not hear very often these days. 2 hits, 10 strikeouts, and that's a good Tampa lineup he was mowing down there. So terrific work from Tanaka, as Michael Kay put it, a man's performance. And the Yankees, who added some firepower with Encarnación this weekend. Stanton comes back tonight and possibly Judge later this week. So things are looking up for the first place Bombers. You can follow us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer in our Mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to us via Twitter or Facebook, really however you'd like to engage with us. We love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we asked if Clint Frazier will ever play another game in a Yankees uniform. And I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about the acquisition of Edwin Encarnación. And in just a minute, author and architecture critic Paul Goldberger joins us in the studio. Paul has written a terrific new book called Ballpark, Baseball in the American City, and we're going to talk about that. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Which of these 4 Yankees hit the most home runs in the 1997 season? Was it A, Cecil Fielder, B, Paul O'Neill, C, Tino Martinez, or D, Bernie Williams? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
We are joined this week on Bronx Bombers by a very special guest, Paul Goldberger, author of the brand new book Ballpark, Baseball in the American City, which Kirkus, in their starred review, called a tour de force that will appeal to devoted baseball fans, architecture devotees, and the casual reader. Paul is formerly the architecture critic for The New Yorker and is now a Vanity Fair contributing editor and began his career at the New York Times, where in 1984, his architecture criticism received the Pulitzer Prize. There are many other books and awards and positions I could list, but that would leave no time at all to talk about Ballpark, which I am very eager to do. Paul, it's great to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Joe. Good to be here.
Now, before we dive into the content of Ballpark, I'm curious, what was it that drew you to this particular project?
Well, I've always loved ballparks. That doesn't make me very unusual, I don't think. And I've always been interested in not only their role as homes for baseball, but their roles as kind of public space. You know, it's one of the great American public spaces, and people don't look at them that way. And, you know, most of my professional life has been spent writing about architecture and cities and how they develop and change over time. I love baseball, and I figured it was time to put those 2 things together.
You know, I was struck by a remark you make early in the book that references 2 of our founding fathers, Jefferson and Hamilton, and I'll quote, in the ballpark, the 2 sides of the American character, the Jeffersonian impulse toward open space and rural expanse, and the Hamiltonian belief in the city and in industrial infrastructure are joined and cannot be torn apart, unquote. I wonder if you could expand on that, because I think you put your finger on something that a lot of people feel instinctively when they walk into a ballpark, but maybe haven't heard articulated in just that way.
Sure. Well, you know, the ballpark is probably the most wonderful coming together of the man-made and the natural that we have. You know, no other athletic field is quite the same, even though football and soccer are often played on grass, although often not, because they're completely bound in space and defined by the gridiron, you don't really feel that they're an open expanse of country. Obviously, other games like basketball and hockey are not played in natural settings at all, unless hockey's played outdoors, but professional hockey's not. So, you know, professional baseball is the only major team sport that's played on a field that really makes you think of rural expanses and all the things that make people love the country. But at the same time, you're surrounded by this enormous structure that, at its best, when it really works, symbolizes the best of the city, the best of the man-made urban environment that we create. And the way the two of them come together, in a great ballpark, they're almost in a kind of harmonic balance, like a kind of equilibrium between the natural and the man-made.
Now, I happen to be somebody who loves when myths are shattered and the truth exposed. And as much as I love the movie Field of Dreams, the notion it presents, or at least implies, that somehow the game of baseball is a product of America's heartland, that, its true essence is to be found in an Iowa cornfield, is false, which isn't to say that, baseball isn't loved in rural areas. Some of our very best teams and players have come from the South and the Midwest. But as you explain it in your book, it is indeed a city game, is it not?
I think you said it really well, Joe. Its roots are more urban than rural. It's true we have this great myth, not only Field of Dreams, but in effect, all of Cooperstown is built on that myth as well. But in fact, it was not created in all at one moment on some beautiful rustic rural field. It developed in a number of different urban places based on several different older games of rounders, the British game crickets, and so forth. And the American variant kind of took hold, became very, very popular in a lot of urban areas, and in fact, particularly so in New York, where a lot of teams played. And its origins are really much more as a city game. And that's part of, I think, the magic of it and why there's something so wonderful about the way a ballpark is a great piece of civic architecture and a natural, open, wonderful piece of open space.
And so the story really begins in Brooklyn at a man named William Kameyer's Union Grounds in Williamsburg, where I learned, among other things from your book, that the tradition of playing the Star-Spangled Banner before games originated. Now, I'm guessing most of our listeners have not heard the name William Kameyer. I certainly hadn't before I read your book. So tell us, if you would, Paul, about his background and contributions.
Kameyer was an entrepreneur. He was a good friend of Boss Tweed, who a lot of people have heard of, the famous head of Tammany Hall, the corrupt political boss of New York. There's no evidence that he himself was necessarily corrupt, but he was a businessman who did a number of things. I think he had a leather business, among other things, and also owned a skating rink. The skating rink was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. It was not doing that well. He wanted to monetize it a little bit more. And he saw that baseball was becoming more and more popular as a spectator sport. It began really just as a sport for the players themselves, but more and more people were going to a place called Elysian Fields on the Hudson River, across the Hudson River, actually in Hoboken, which was a very popular playing ground and in fact became almost like a sort of early version of an amusement park with a lot of other attractions and things. And baseball was just one of the things that went on there. Kameyer thought, all these people want to watch baseball. Maybe we can do something with this. He's the first guy to have actually had a baseball field with a fence around it and to charge money for people to come in. So I mark that as the first baseball park, Union Grounds in Williamsburg, long gone, of course.
Now, for New York fans that are laboring under the impression that the history of professional baseball in this city began with the Yankees, Giants, and Dodgers, not so. There was this whole kind of prehistory of professional New York teams that you discuss in Ballpark. The Knickerbockers, the Gothams, the Eagles. And in the mid-19th century, a series of critical gatherings were held, two of them at Smith's Hotel on Howard Street in what is now we call Soho, to try and sort of sort out some basic bylaws, rules of play. Talk about that period a little, Paul, and what were some of the rules that were hashed out at Smith's Hotel?
Well, it was just beginning to kind of come together at that point. And there were different versions of the game played in different areas. There was a kind of Massachusetts version, and there was a New York version. And the different teams didn't always agree either. And so the sport was gradually evolving toward becoming more professional. The team started out as amateurs. They became, steadily sort of slightly more professional. There was, in fact, a team that was indirectly connected to Boss Tweed that consisted of an awful lot of New York City employees who, it is generally believed, did not do much except pretend to have a job which paid them to play baseball, which at that point nobody really got paid for. But they were beginning to be, and the sport was gradually evolving toward becoming professional. An awful lot of stuff had not been codified at that point. The number of innings, for example, was not certain and did not get fixed until I believe at that Smith's Hotel meeting. Certain things that of course have continued to evolve. Balls and strikes and so forth were fixed at that point. While the game has continued to evolve, that was the most important kind of codification up to that point, at least.
Now, something else you point out that's worth noting is that advances in transportation technology played a crucial role in the rise of baseball. Train travel, trolleys, and streetcars within cities. The development of our two major leagues in the 1870s would never have happened without that. Talk about the impact of 19th century transportation on the rise of baseball and their kind of interconnectedness.
Sure. In fact, that one of the wonderful things about writing this book was discovering how baseball connects to almost everything, actually. And first, a lot of the early teams were actually owned by streetcar companies or by the people who owned streetcar companies because they thought baseball would be a useful thing to drive traffic on the streetcar. Very often, of course, because even in the primitive real estate world of the 19th century, it was expensive to put a baseball park right in the heart of downtown. You needed too much space. So they would often build them on the edge in neighborhoods that were just developing at that point. That's certainly the case in Boston, where Fenway Park was built by the Taylor family, owners of the Boston Red Sox at the time, who also had a lot of significant real estate interests and were developing the Fenway area. And they thought that the new ballpark would be a great way to get people to this new part of town in Back Bay, which is why they called it Fenway Park and not Taylor Park, for example, even in a day when a lot of owners were naming ballparks after themselves. So the streetcar and baseball were intimately connected in many, many cities. Then, of course, the rise of intercity train travel made it possible to have leagues of teams in different cities some distance away and actually have an organized schedule. Couldn't work without that. But, before you could take a train to Cleveland or Cincinnati or Boston or what have you, or St. Louis, teams there and teams in New York or Boston or Baltimore couldn't play each other very easily. It was just too difficult to arrange. They had to be kind of special one-shot events where probably they would write letters and arrange a game on such and such a date, and it would happen. But you couldn't have a regular schedule the way we do now. But intercity train travel made it possible to do that. So the leagues arose in direct response to that technology.
Now, the two oldest functioning Major League ballparks are Fenway, which opened in 1912, and Wrigley, which opened 2 years later. And that was, I guess, you could call the golden era of ballparks. Not just those two, but Shibe Park in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh's Forbes Field, and Ebbets Field, which we'll get to in a second. But those two, Fenway and Wrigley, have very deep ties to their cities, economic ties, emotional ties. They're almost like secular cathedrals. What were some of the discoveries that you made, Paul, in your research into those two ballparks, and how would you characterize their position in the overall evolution of ballparks?
Well, they're both important. They're both wonderful. They're both justly beloved. Thank goodness we still have both of them. And they've both been this is getting ahead of the story, but they've both been pretty thoughtfully restored and renovated to make them viable for 21st century needs. they were not by any means, the only things from that golden age. They're just the only two survivors. There was also, as you point out, Shibe Park in Philadelphia, which of 1909, it actually preceded them and was in many ways actually one of the grandest ballparks ever built. If you went by it on the outside, if you just simply drove by it in North Philadelphia, you could well mistake it for an opera house or something like that. It was so grandiose. And of course, there was Ebbets Field and Tiger Stadium in Detroit, which opened originally as Navin Field, then became Briggs Stadium and later Tiger Stadium. And it opened, in fact, on the same day, April 20th, 1912, as Fenway. And alas, is no longer with us. But it was, in each case, these ballparks had an intimate connection to their neighborhood, to their city, to their identity. I learned a lot of wonderful stuff about Wrigley, including, of course, that it was originally built by Charles Wiegman and called Wiegman Park, not Wrigley Field. And he was a restaurant owner in Chicago who'd become very successful with a chain of restaurants and invested in a very short-lived enterprise called the Federal League, which was an attempt to create a third baseball league. His team was the largest, the sort of dominant player in the Federal League. The Federal League only lasted a couple of years. It fell apart. And in the complicated process of dismantling it, Wiegman ended up as the controlling shareholder of the Chicago Cubs, which he then promptly moved into his ballpark. And then it was renamed Cubs Park for a while. And it was only in the late 1920s that the name was changed to Wrigley Field to reflect William Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate, who had actually been a minority investor in the Cubs. And then when Wiegman ran into some financial difficulties, Wrigley increased his stake and before long owned the whole team.
Now, a park that sadly is long gone, demolished in 1960, is Ebbets Field. And while far from perfect, you have a quote in your book about the narrow aisles, the rusting pillars, the dirty bathrooms. It did have something in common with Fenway and Wrigley, and this is something that both my parents, who saw games there as kids, have told me about, and that is intimacy. Talk a little about Ebbets Field, the ways in which it interacted with its neighborhood of Flatbush, and also some of the reasons for its decline and destruction.
Ebbets is a long and complicated and sad story in so many ways, because in some ways it was really the greatest of all ballparks. It may not have been quite as ornate as Shibe Park in Philadelphia, but it came reasonably close. It was the sort of apotheosis of baseball in Brooklyn. All of those many, many teams that existed in the early years, kind of led to this one great major league team, the Dodgers, and its flamboyant owner, Charlie Ebbets, who really was, he and the team were really synonymous with Brooklyn for a very, very long time. And the ballpark was just, beautifully set into this residential neighborhood in Flatbush. It was some distance out from the center of New York or even from downtown Brooklyn, but it was very accessible by subway, so people could easily get there by mass transit or walk from surrounding neighborhoods and so forth. And it flourished for a very, very long time. Its decline came, I think, as a result of several things, probably most emphatically the fact that the team stopped caring about it and did not really seek to invest in it very much. Walter O'Malley, who was the owner in the 50s, and who is reviled, of course, for having taken the team to Los Angeles. What I learned in my research was not so much that O'Malley did not hate Brooklyn, he did not hate New York. What he hated was Ebbets Field, which he thought was decrepit, dirty, and impossible to renovate successfully. He also was very, very conscious of the evolving trends in the 1950s. A lot of the Dodgers fan base had moved to Long Island or New Jersey. It was a long and difficult trip by car. There was not enough parking. There was not an easy way to expand parking and improve those aspects of the ballpark at all. And you got to remember that in the 50s, that was back when the car was thought of as this wonderful, liberating thing. I mean, what could be better than everybody having their own car and a house in the suburbs and a backyard and expressways to take you everywhere? Nobody had yet figured out that all of this was going to come at a very high price and would not only damage our cities, but would have environmental consequences, and also that the expressways would become, nightmares of traffic jams and all that stuff. So what O'Malley wanted was just a different kind of fan experience, and he thought, I think quite wrongly, by the way, but he thought Ebbets Field was beyond fixing up. We see from the great things that have happened at both Fenway and Wrigley, the two survivors from that time, that in fact it's very possible to fix them up. And not only that people love them. All you have to do is keep it clean, have a few more choices of places to eat than we offered back then, and frankly, a few more places to go to the bathroom than they offered back then. But in fact, a good architect can solve those problems. Those are not, this is not rocket science. It's doable. And we've seen it done in both of those surviving old ballparks. So it could have happened at Ebbets Field, but it was a different time. It was a time when also the consciousness of historic buildings was not so great in this country. And we thought, if it's old and kind of worn out and dirty and uncomfortable, why don't we just throw it away and make something new? The idea that you could actually preserve it and fix it up and make it work in a new way, that didn't come into this country's mindset really until many years after we lost Ebbets Field.
And another park that met the same fate was the Polo Grounds, actually older than both Ebbets Field and Yankee Stadium. That was a multi-purpose park with a very unusual structure. Talk a bit about the unique elements of the Polo Grounds and its eventual decline. I think you write that by 1956, the Giants' last year in New York, also the Dodgers, that the Giants had the worst attendance in the National League, right?
Right, yes. Well, the Polo Grounds was unusual. Much of my book, I complain about multi-purpose stadiums as basically being very bad for both baseball and football, the usual sport that they're combined with, and being a compromise that serves neither sport very well. The Polo Grounds maybe is a funny exception to it. It's symmetrical. It was pretty long and narrow and wide. It had a semicircular end at the south where where home plate was, and then of course this incredibly deep center field. But given that one of the things that makes ballparks special is that they're all a little bit different, and the dimensions, the proportions, everything varies a little bit from ballpark to ballpark, from city to city. The only thing that's absolutely ironclad and rigid and cannot vary by even a millimeter is the diamond itself. But everything else, you can do all kinds of things with. So having one ballpark that is very long and symmetrical was kind of okay, I guess, just as part of the broader mix. And that did make it actually sort of paradoxically kind of work a little bit better for football, for track, for certain other things. But the Giants, like the Dodgers, thought of that stadium as a relic that they had no interest in investing in, and they were much more interested in looking to greener pastures. Now, the one difference is that the Dodgers very seriously pursued some alternatives here in Brooklyn before they went to Los Angeles. There were some very interesting schemes, in fact, one of them by a great mid-century modern designer, Norman Belgetti's, for a huge stadium in downtown Brooklyn, right across the street from where the Barclays Center has now been built. And O'Malley would have built that had Robert Moses not gotten in the way of it and prevented it from actually happening. And it was only when all of his various schemes to stay in Brooklyn fell apart that he made the deal with Los Angeles. The other thing I learned, by the way, was that the Giants had been talking with a few cities for a while, including Minneapolis. Horace Stoneham actually had been interested in moving for some time. The National League let them know that it would not approve either transfer of the franchise unless they both went. And the idea was that it made no sense to have only one team in California. You needed more than one so that teams from the East would not travel that whole distance just to play one series of games with one team. But it meant everybody in the National League could play the Giants and the Dodgers on every trip, and thus justify the amount of time and expense of travel with a broader series of games. And their move also connects to something else we talked about earlier when we were discussing how the rise of intercity train travel in the 19th century made it possible for the leagues to be established and to actually have an organized schedule. Similarly, it's not an accident that the Dodgers and the Giants moved to California at just the time that we had for the first time transcontinental jet travel. Because if you had to take a train all the way across the country every time any team played a California team, it would not have been worth it.
Yeah, I never thought about that. And I also never knew about this mandate that both those teams had to relocate to California.
They said, we will not approve either one of you unless you both go, thus sort of tying their fates to each other. And in fact, even though O'Malley and the Dodgers may have become sort of more famous for going to California because of the bitter controversy over their leaving Brooklyn, it was actually Stoneham and the Giants who committed first. And O'Malley kind of dithered for a long time as he continued to play with some of these ideas for a new stadium in Brooklyn. And only when everything kind of fell through did he then resume the negotiations with Los Angeles and make a deal, at which point the Giants were free to go also.
That's Paul Goldberger, author of Ballpark, Baseball in the American City. You've been listening to part 1 of that conversation, and you can hear part 2 of our interview on the next episode of Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which Yankee hit the most home runs in the 1997 season? The answer? C. Tino Martinez, with 44. And now, here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. Will Clint Frazier play another game in a Yankees uniform? And 61% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said no, and 39% said yes. So Frazier has become a kind of hot topic on social media because of all the controversy about various media attentions and his hair, his shoes, none of which I really care about. So let's take a look at the numbers and kind of keep our eye on the ball here, which he needs to do a lot more of in right field. He's been terrible as a fielder, but as a hitter, and we'll just look at percentage stats since he hasn't played as much as most of the guys on our roster. So Frazier is hitting .283, and that's fourth behind LeMahieu, Urshela, and Glaber. I'm not including Judge and Didi because both have played just a handful of games this year, so their average is skewed. Frazier's OPS, that's on base plus slugging, is a respectable 843, actually more than respectable. That's identical to the OPS of one Mookie Betts, and behind only Sanchez, Voit, and Glaber on the team. So he's definitely contributed offensively. I mean, you can see the talent. His defense, as I said, is not good. That's putting it nicely. The party line on why he was sent down on Sunday is the Yankees want him to play every day. Stanton's coming back today. Judge is maybe a week away or less, and the Yankees didn't want to lose Cameron Maybin, who's been good, on waivers, and there's no room at DH now with Encarnación. And those are all fairly persuasive reasons. I personally think, though, and this is just a feeling, I have no inside knowledge, I think that his days here are very much numbered. I think the chances are excellent that he goes to Scranton and dominates, and that Cashman is hoping that that boosts his trade value even more, and also hoping he doesn't continue to stumble and bumble in right right field. I mean, they're not going to DH him down there. That would just be like too obvious, a too obvious ploy to mask his deficiencies in the outfield. So the Yankees are in desperate need of, I believe, not one but two starters. With Severino a giant question mark, really the whole staff is question marks. I mean, I'll say a little more about that in our mailbag segment, but we need starting pitching. I think everybody agrees about that at this point. And I think, I think Frazier's on the block. I think maybe Estrada is on the block, sadly. I like him very much. And, if Cashman can make headway on someone like Max Scherzer, probably Florial is on the block. I mean, those are our three prime minor league pieces right now. Frazier, Estrada, and Florial. And with this team loaded for bear offensively, adding a guy like Scherzer and maybe also like a Marcus Stroman, I mean, probably not both of those guys. That probably won't happen. But if you're Brian Cashman, now is the time to make your run. We have the pieces on offense. We have the bullpen. And so, yes, I mean, I would say, barring injury to one of our outfielders, which is always a possibility. This is 2019 after all. But barring that, I think Frazier is a goner, and maybe that's best. I mean, he seems kind of, I don't know, he does seem kind of primed to fight a war with the New York media. That's a war that he cannot possibly win. And, I hope that for his sake, as he gets a little older, he builds up a kind of, veneer to the press and to what people say about him. I think if he doesn't, he's gonna drive himself crazy. But I do think he probably will. But yeah, I think barring injury to one of our outfielders, Frazier is a goner. All right, it's time for this week's mailbag segment. Our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Frank in Hoboken. And by the way, you can find us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle. Send me a DM or shoot me a message on our Facebook page. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Frank writes, why is Cashman wasting money on another right-handed power bat when we need pitching so bad? Has he lost his mind? Well, thanks for that question, Frank. It's a good one. No, I don't think Cashman has lost his mind. But as I've said many times, I do not think he adequately addressed our pitching shortcomings during the offseason. I think you'll agree with that. Stanton took a lot of heat during the offseason, and justifiably so, for his performance or lack thereof against the Red Sox in the ALDS. But how about the pitchers? I mean, other than Tanaka, we had three total no-shows out of Happ, Severino, and Sabathia. And so Cashman signs, Sabathia and Happ, two aging, homer-prone pitchers. I mean, Sabathia has been especially horrible recently. Last four starts in ERA of 7 with 30 hits and 6 home runs. So yeah, horrible. Severino signs an extension and boom, he's on the shelf. Who knows when we'll see him again? I mean, did he keep that injury from the Yankees before doing that extension? I don't know. We'll never know. But, Paxton's good, but fragile. So no, Cashman did not do what he said he would do, assemble a championship rotation this offseason. He might say that nobody was available for reasonable cost. Everybody was pushing for Corbin. He has not been great, okay? ERA is 4.11 in Washington. It's not terrible, but not great. And this month, his ERA is 9. I mean, people wanted Keuchel a few weeks ago. His first appearance in Double-A for the Braves, he got shelled. 11 hits, I think. So, I mean, that could change. He's just, coming off of a long fallow period. But, we don't always know everything about what's going on. So, Frank, I agree about the pitching, and we definitely need that. But I disagree that Encarnación was a bad move. We give up nothing for the leading home run hitter in the American League. Okay, it's not a long-term deal. It ends next year, and Seattle is paying $8.5 million of his tab this year. Tampa is also chipping in as a result of the 3-team deal that they made with the Indians last year. So Tampa is paying Edwin Encarnación to help knock themselves out of the division race. How do you like them apples? He also plays, a good first base. So there's nothing wrong with this deal unless it meant that the Yankees were standing pat on pitching. But Frank, I don't think they are. As I said earlier, I think everyone, including Brian Cashman, knows what we need. He acquired 2 pitchers last year midseason, Happ and Lynn. I think he will again. I mean, one worked out well for the most part, Hap. Lynn did not, so hopefully he finds better arms than last year. But Encarnación is an immediate upgrade at DH. I mean, from the DH spot, we've hit 235 this year. He's hit 270 as a DH in 89 plate appearances from that position with 6 home runs, 21 in all. I mean, since 2012, no one has more home runs or RBIs than Edwin Encarnación. He destroys the Red Sox, and he's not bad against the Astros either. So, Frank, as long as this doesn't negate our pitching search, I'm good with it. And as far as the right-handed lineup, I think this is the most righties we've had in a lineup in many decades. I think righty-lefty is very much overblown. The Yankees' right-handed bats this year have been fantastic against righty pitching. In fact, they lead the majors in OPS against righties. So just forget about that, Frank. This is an upgrade, pure and simple, at very low cost. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, find us on Spotify, follow us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle, like us on Facebook as well, and thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again on July 1st. Take care.